There are moments in a man's life when everything sharpens, when all the noise fades, and you see things as they truly are. That night, standing in my own workshop, staring at my wife and the bastard who ruined my marriage, was one of those moments. I'd spent the last 40 years working leather, and I knew the feeling of something stretched too thin, about to snap. This wasn't much different. Isaac Keller leaned against my workbench like he owned the place, one hand in his pocket, the other wrapped around a glass of whiskey he sure as hell didn't pour himself. My whiskey, my workshop, my wife, standing too damn close to him. Delilah's face went pale when she saw me. I didn't say a word, just watched. Watched her fidget with the gold bracelet on her wrist, one I didn't buy. Watched Keller adjust his cufflinks like none of this mattered. Finally, he smiled, easy and practiced. Colin, isn't it? He had one of those smooth, practiced voices, the kind of tone that worked in boardrooms and expensive restaurants. He extended his hand like we were old friends. Isaac Keller. It's a pleasure. I looked at his hand, then at him. I didn't shake it. Delilah cleared her throat, stepping forward like she was about to explain away the whole damn thing. Colin, I held up a hand. No, that shut her up. Keller exhaled through his nose, set his drink down. Look, I understand this is an uncomfortable situation, but I'd rather not have this be more unpleasant than it needs to be. Unpleasant. Hell of a word for what was happening here. I finally spoke. You two finish up here. I'll have your bags packed by the time you get home. Delilah's mouth opened, then closed. Her brain worked behind those green eyes, scrambling for something to say, something to make me doubt what I already knew. I didn't give her the chance. I turned and walked out. The night air was cool when I stepped onto the sidewalk outside Lawrence Leatherworks. I could still smell the rich scent of tanned hides and oil from inside, but it didn't settle me the way it usually did. Not tonight. I got in my truck and drove home. No music, no talk radio. Just the sound of the tires on the road, steady and familiar. The house was dark when I got there. I flicked on the porch light, the same light Delilah used to leave on for me when I worked late. I walked inside and headed straight for the bedroom. Packing didn't take long. She never was one for clutter. Dresses, blouses, neatly folded and stacked in the old blue suitcase we took on our honeymoon. That thought should have hurt. It didn't. I pulled the zipper closed, carried it outside, and set it neatly by the curb. Then I went back in, grabbed another, and did the same. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Just one line. You made your choice. Now live with it. Then I changed the locks. When I was done, I sat at the kitchen table, the house quiet except for the old clock ticking above the stove. I should have felt something. Anger, grief, anything. Instead, I just felt done. By the time her car pulled up, the coffee in my cup had gone cold. I didn't get up. Didn't need to. She saw the suitcases the second she stepped out of the car. She stood there a long time, hands in her coat pockets, staring at them like maybe if she stood there long enough, they'd disappear. They didn't. Eventually, she bent, lifted one, and looked toward the house. Maybe expecting me to step outside, say something, make this easier for her. I didn't. I waited until she loaded the bags into the trunk and drove off. Then I turned off the porch light and went to bed. Tomorrow, life moved on. The sun was just starting to rise when I stepped into the workshop the next morning. The air inside was cool, carrying the familiar scent of leather and oil, the same as it had for the past 40 years. I set down my thermos and got to work, just like any other day. If anyone was expecting me to fall apart, they'd be disappointed. A man doesn't spend his life shaping something permanent just to let it crumble over a woman who didn't know what permanence meant. Midway through cutting a new set of straps, the bell above the front door jingled. I didn't look up. We're not open yet. Yeah, I know, Tom's voice answered. Figured you wouldn't be sleeping in. I grabbed the burnishing tool, working it along the edges of the leather. What gave it away? He pulled up the stool near my workbench, setting his coffee down. Heard about last night. Town sure works fast. He snorted. It was Nathan. He said Delilah came into the cafe this morning looking like hell. I didn't react. Just kept working the leather, the steady back and forth of my hands keeping my thoughts from drifting. She's Isaac's problem now. Tom grunted. That won't last. Don't care. He sipped his coffee, watching me work. You gonna take her back when she comes crawling? I set the tool down, finally meeting his gaze. No. Tom nodded once, like he expected that answer. Good. He leaned back against the workbench, stretching his legs out. Keller's a slick son of a bitch. Makes his money making people think he's their friend while he bleeds him dry. I picked up my knife, started cutting another strap. He doesn't matter. He will when he starts sniffing around, wondering why you're not rolling over like every other man whose wife he's stolen. I stopped cutting. Looked up. You think I should roll over? Tom grinned. Hell no. I think you should make sure he regrets it. I set the knife down and wiped my hands on my apron. That's the plan. Tom chuckled. That's what I figured. The bell jingled again. This time, it was Jenny, my assistant. She hesitated in the doorway, her hands gripping the strap of her purse. Morning, Mr. Lawrence. Tom gave her a nod, pushing off the workbench. I was just leaving. Let the man work. Jenny waited until the door shut behind him before stepping forward. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. About, Delilah. I nodded, picking up my knife again. Appreciate it. She hesitated, then reached into her bag. She left this at the office. I didn't know if you wanted it or if I should just... She stopped, holding out a small framed photo. It was from our wedding. Younger versions of ourselves, smiling like we had it all figured out. I took it from her, looked at it for all of 3 seconds, then set it face down on the workbench. Trash. Jenny swallowed. Okay. She hesitated again. If you need anything, eh? I don't. She nodded quickly. Right. Well, I'll get started on inventory. I watched her retreat to the front desk, shaking my head. People expected something from me, tears, anger, some kind of reaction. They didn't understand that I'd already processed it. I'd made my decision. I wasn't wasting time looking back. By noon, the whispers had made their way through town. The cafe, the hardware store, even the post office, everyone knew. Delilah had tried to go to her sister's place, but she hadn't even made it past the front door. Her family had more sense than she did. Isaac, I heard, had taken her in. Good. Let her get what she wanted. See how long it lasted. I spent the rest of the day working. No distractions, no unnecessary conversations. When I locked up for the night, the street outside was quiet, the town settling into its usual rhythm. As I walked to my truck, I caught a glimpse of movement across the street, Delilah, stepping out of Isaac's sleek black car. She saw me, and for a second, I thought she might say something. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove off without looking back. A week passed, and the town had settled into its usual rhythm. People talked, sure, but no one said a damn thing to my face. I could feel the looks when I walked into Gus's diner in the mornings, the kind of quiet glances that lasted just long enough to be noticed. Didn't matter. I wasn't interested in sympathy. I had work to do. Tom sat across from me, shoving a forkful of eggs into his mouth like he hadn't eaten in days. Heard Keller's been strutting around like he wants something, he muttered, talking around his food. I poured another cup of coffee, watching the steam rise. Let him. Delilah was at the cafe yesterday. Nathan says she sat in the corner, didn't talk much. Didn't look too happy either. He took another bite, chewed for a while. That ain't surprising. Keller's the type that likes the chase, not the catch. I didn't say anything. I already knew it. Isaac Keller was a collector. He liked owning things, businesses, land, people. Women like Delilah, desperate for attention, were easy targets. He showered them with gifts, compliments, gave them the feeling of being something special. Until they weren't. Tom wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. You gonna let this blow over? I looked up at him. No. He grinned. Good. After breakfast, I stopped by the post office. Jenny had left a stack of invoices on my desk that needed mailing. I was halfway through stuffing envelopes when Travis, the bartender from Gus's, walked in. He nodded at me as he stepped to the counter, leaning against it like a man with too much time on his hands. Heard something interesting last night, he said, loud enough to be heard over the shuffle of mail. I sealed another envelope. That right? Couple of suits came into the bar, talking real careful. Said they worked for Keller. He scratched the side of his neck. Something about a deal going south. IRS sniffing around. I slid the last envelope into the stack, set it aside. Now that was interesting. Travis tapped his fingers on the counter. Word is, Keller's been cooking his books for years. Fudging numbers, dodging taxes, screwing over investors. But someone tipped off the right people, and now they're digging. I met his gaze. You don't say. He shrugged. Just what I heard. He pushed off the counter, heading for the door. Figured you might find that useful. I watched him leave, the door swinging shut behind him. Then I reached for my phone. By the time I got back to the workshop, I had a name and an address. A guy in accounting, someone who used to work for Keller and didn't leave on good terms. Apparently, he had a habit of keeping records that Keller didn't know still existed. I spent the afternoon working, letting the weight of the information settle. The leather felt solid in my hands, familiar. Steady. It was the same way my father used to describe the work, something real, something honest. You couldn't fake good craftsmanship. Couldn't cut corners without it showing. A man's reputation was the same way. Eventually, the cracks started showing, and Keller's were about to break wide open. The next morning, I drove out to a small office on the edge of town, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in a decade. The man I was looking for, Alan Webster, was already waiting when I walked in. He was younger than me, maybe early 40s, with the tired look of someone who'd spent too many years fighting losing battles. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "You Lawrence." "I Saturday, that's right." He folded his hands. "I don't like Keller." "Good." I leaned back. "Then we'll get along just fine." Webster studied me for a moment, then opened a desk drawer, pulling out a thick folder. He slid it across the desk. "Everything's in there. False expense reports, shell companies, tax fraud. You name it, he's done it." I flipped through the pages. This wasn't just dirt. This was the kind of thing that ended careers. Webster rubbed his jaw. "Keller ruined a lot of people. You make sure this gets to the right hands." I closed the folder, tucked it under my arm. "I will." When I walked out of that office, I felt something I hadn't in a while. Control. I took my time with the folder. A man only gets one shot at something like this, and I wasn't about to waste mine rushing. Over the next couple of days, I read through every page, cross-referenced names, dates, and numbers. Keller had been running his business the way a thief runs a 3-card Monte game: quick hands, fast talk, and just enough misdirection to keep people from noticing they were getting robbed. Problem was, he'd gotten careless. I made 3 copies. One for the IRS, one for the state attorney's office, and one for a business journalist in the city who had a reputation for digging into men like Keller and making sure everyone knew exactly how they'd made their money. I mailed the first 2 copies from a town 2 counties over. The third one, I delivered in person. The journalist, Peter Monroe, was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with the sharp eyes of a man who lived off the scent of a good scandal. He flipped through the pages while I sat across from him in a coffee shop, nodding to himself, occasionally muttering under his breath. Finally, he closed the folder and looked up at me. "You realize this could bury him, right?" "That's the idea." He studied me for a long moment, then smiled. "I'll make sure it gets out." That was all I needed to hear. I left the coffee shop, walked back to my truck, and drove home. The waiting was the hardest part. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then, on the 4th morning, I stopped by Gus's for coffee, and the whole place was buzzing. Tom met me at the door, grinning like he'd already won a bet. "You see the paper yet?" I stepped inside. Half the tables had a copy of the morning's edition open, Keller's name printed bold across the front page. "IRS investigates local business tycoon." I took my usual seat at the counter. Nathan, the cafe owner, slid a fresh cup of coffee in front of me without asking. "People are saying it's just the beginning. Could turn into a full-blown fraud case." "Could," I agreed. Tom sat next to me, slapping a hand on the counter. "Delilah's gotta be sweating now." She was. I already knew it. 2 nights ago, she'd shown up at the workshop. She wasn't crying, wasn't screaming. She just stood in the doorway, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. "Colin," she'd said. I kept working. "I didn't know about any of this," she continued. "I swear." I set the mallet down, looked up at her. "And that's supposed to change something?" She swallowed hard, shifting her weight. "I made a mistake." I nodded, then picked up my tools again. "Yeah, you did." She didn't have anything left to say after that. Back at the cafe, Tom was still grinning. "Bet Keller's losing his damn mind." I took a sip of coffee. "I imagine so." He chuckled. "He ain't the type to go down quiet." "No," I said, setting the cup down. "But he's still going down." By the end of the week, the investigation had grown teeth. The state froze some of Keller's assets. A few of his business partners started distancing themselves, issuing statements about how they had no idea he'd been involved in anything shady. People who used to shake his hand now avoided him in public. Delilah stopped showing up in town. I heard from Nathan that she'd tried to go back to her sister's place, but the door had stayed shut. A couple of days later, someone saw her leaving town with a suitcase and a hollow look in her eyes. Keller lasted a little longer. He fought it, of course. Hired the best lawyers money could buy. Made threats. Called in favors. None of it worked. By the time summer rolled around, the case against him was airtight. He lost everything. I didn't go to the courthouse on the day of the verdict. Didn't need to. I already knew how it was going to end. Keller was finished. His businesses collapsed one by one. Like a row of dominoes, someone finally stopped propping up. The papers ran the story for weeks: fraud charges, tax evasion, bankruptcy hearings. He tried to hold on, throwing money at lawyers, trying to spin it like he was the victim of some witch hunt. But there was too much against him. When men like him fall, they don't fall halfway. They go all the way down. Tom and I were sitting in Gus's, watching the news on the little TV mounted in the corner, when it finally happened. Keller in a cheap suit, walking into a courthouse, swarmed by cameras. His usual arrogance was gone. He looked tired, beaten. His hands clenched at his sides like he was still trying to hold on to something that wasn't there anymore. Tom whistled low. Ain't got that polished look no more. I sipped my coffee. Nope. Nathan leaned against the counter, drying a glass. Heard he sold his house. Too much debt. He's been holed up in a motel outside town. Tom shook his head. From a mansion to a damn roadside motel. Life comes at you fast. Delilah was nowhere to be found. I figured she was long gone. Probably ran off to another city, hoping to start over somewhere nobody knew what she'd done. The town wasn't going to forget. Hell, her own family hadn't forgiven her. Whatever life she thought she was getting, it was already over before it started. I finished my coffee, tossed a few bills on the counter, and headed out. I had work to do. The shop was busy when I got back. Orders were coming in steady, mostly from out-of-towners who'd heard about Lawrence Leatherworks through word of mouth. Jenny was at the front desk, scribbling in the ledger, and one of my apprentices, Cody, was working at the back table, shaping a belt with careful, deliberate strokes. He looked up when I walked in. Morning, boss. I nodded. How's it coming? Good. Almost done with this one. I stepped closer, checking his work. The edges were smooth, the burnishing even. He come a long way in the past year. Not bad, I said. But see here. I pointed at a section near the buckle. Too much pressure. You'll wear the leather thin over time. Cody frowned, nodding. Got it. I'll fix it. I clapped a hand on his shoulder. You're getting there. Jenny cleared her throat from the front. There's a man waiting for you in the office. Said it's important. I raised an eyebrow. Who? She hesitated. Didn't say. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked into the office. The second I stepped through the door, I felt it. That quiet tension, the kind that settles in when something's about to happen. Keller was sitting in my chair. He looked different. The expensive suits were gone, replaced with a wrinkled button-down and slacks that didn't fit him right. The silver-haired, confident businessman had been replaced by a man who'd been chewed up and spat out by the world. He looked smaller somehow, like losing everything had taken inches off his height. I didn't say anything, just leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. I assume you know. I nodded once. I know. He gave a humorless chuckle. Of course you do. I waited. He leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees. I'm leaving town. There's nothing left for me here. I didn't respond. He glanced around the office, taking in the walls lined with old photos, my father, my grandfather, the generations of craftsmen who came before me. His eyes landed on a framed newspaper clipping, an article from years ago about Lawrence Leatherworks being one of the oldest family-run businesses in the state. He shook his head. You never lost anything, did you? I pushed off the doorframe. Get to the point. He met my gaze. I want to know, was it you? I didn't answer. Didn't need to. Keller let out a slow breath, nodding like he'd already known the answer before he even asked. He stood, smoothing a hand down the front of his shirt. You really think she was worth all this? She had nothing to do with it. He tilted his head. Then why? I stepped forward, just enough to close the distance between us. Because men like you think you can take whatever you want. You thought I'd roll over. You thought I'd be another name on your list of people you've stepped on. You were wrong. He studied me for a long moment. Then he laughed, short and bitter. Guess I was. I didn't move as he walked past me, heading for the door. He stopped with one hand on the knob. For what it's worth, I underestimated you. I met his gaze. I know. He nodded once, then walked out. I listened to his footsteps fade down the hall, the front door swinging shut behind him. Then I turned, sat in my chair, and got back to work. Life didn't change overnight. The shop still smelled like leather and oil, the tools still fit in my hands the way they always had, and the town kept moving, same as it ever did. But there was a difference now, something quieter, something that settled deep in my bones. Keller was gone. Delilah, too. There was no dramatic final scene, no shouting in the streets, no last words to make sense of everything. Just absence. And that was fine by me. Orders kept coming in, and I kept working. People still stopped by the shop, not to pry, just to nod in quiet approval, to let me know that whatever had happened, they respected the way I handled it. That was enough. One afternoon, I was finishing up a custom belt when Jenny knocked lightly on the office door. "Mr. Lawrence, there's someone here to see you." I glanced up. "Who?" She hesitated. Said her name's Sarah Mitchell. "She's with the community center." That name meant something, though it took me a second to place it. Widow. Ran some programs at the center. Organized charity work. I nodded. "Send her in." A moment later, Sarah stepped inside, offering a polite smile. She was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed but calm, the kind of woman who'd been through plenty but didn't let the weight of it bend her. "Mr. Lawrence, T. Collins for seeing me." "Collins fine," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. She sat, crossing her hands in her lap. "I won't take much of your time. The community center is hosting an event next month, mentorship for young tradesmen. We're bringing in local artisans, small business owners, people who can show these kids that working with your hands is still worth something." I leaned back in my chair. "That right?" She nodded. "I was hoping you'd be part of it." I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because something about it hit different. I'd spent my whole life working with my hands, shaping leather, passing down skills to apprentices who gave a damn about the craft. But this was something else. I drummed my fingers against the desk. "You really think they'd be interested in this kind of work?" Sarah smiled slightly. "I think they'd be interested in hearing from a man who built something that lasts." I met her gaze. There was no flattery in it, no angle. Just truth. I nodded once. "All right." She stood, offering her hand. "Glad to hear it." I shook it, firm and simple. She made her way to the door, then paused. "One more thing." I raised an eyebrow. She tilted her head slightly, studying me. "I know what happened. With your wife." I said nothing. She didn't pry, didn't ask questions. Just nodded like she understood something without needing it explained. "You handled it the way a man should." Then she left. I sat there for a long moment before finally turning back to the belt I was working on. A man's worth isn't in what he loses. It's in what he builds. And I had a lot left to build. A year passed. The shop was busier than ever, orders coming in steady, apprentices learning the trade. My name still meant something in this town. Maybe even more than before. I never had to explain what happened with Delilah. Never had to tell the story. People already knew, and more importantly, they knew how I handled it. That was all that mattered. Keller was a ghost. Word was he tried to set up shop in another city, but the stink of his downfall followed him. Nobody wanted to do business with a man who'd been stripped down to nothing, a man who lost everything because he thought he was untouchable. The last thing I heard, he was barely keeping his head above water, no money, no reputation, just a bitter old man trying to claw back what he'd lost. Delilah never came back. The first few months, people spotted her here and there, trying to settle somewhere new, but it never stuck. She burned every bridge she had, and a woman like her didn't do well without a lifeline. I didn't ask where she ended up. Didn't care. She made her choices, and the world made her live with them. I moved forward. The mentorship program at the community center turned out to be worth more than I expected. I wasn't a man who talked much unless I had something to say, but those kids, some of them just looking for direction, some of them needing something solid to hold on to, they listened. More than that, they worked. Hands on leather, learning how to shape something real, something built to last. One evening after the shop closed, I sat out front, a cold beer in my hand, watching the last of the sunlight fade over the town. Tom pulled up in his truck, climbed out, and dropped into the chair next to me with a grunt. "Damn kids kept me running all day," he muttered, stretching his back. I smirked. "You getting old, Fisher?" He snorted. "Yeah, well, so are you." He cracked open a beer, took a long sip, then glanced over. "Sarah been around?" I took a drink, rolling the bottle between my fingers. "Now and then. She's a good woman." "She is." Tom nodded like that was all he needed to say. We sat there in silence, the quiet hum of crickets filling the air. After a while, he chuckled. "You ever think about how things might have gone different?" I looked at him. "No." He let out a low laugh. "Didn't think so." I drained the last of my beer, set the bottle down beside my chair. "Some things ain't worth looking back on." Tom raised his own bottle in agreement. "Damn right." The night settled in around us. The town was quiet, the way it always was at this hour. The air smelled like leather and sawdust and something clean, something steady. I built this life with my own hands, and no one was ever going to take it from me.